to open up this P and Z meeting Thursday. I think it's October the 21st. We don't need to take roll. Let's go through the presentation, Drew, then we'll open the public hearing.
Okay. Good afternoon. The only thing we have on our agenda is some minor updates to the zoning code. Some of these did come from direction from council. A few of these, or one of these was directed from Planning and Zoning Commission. And then we do have several, I say staff requested. These are things that staff have run into in the code, working with customers or projects, just clarifications and some issues that we've seen in the code. Obviously, as we rewrote the zoning code, we knew we'd have some cleanup and some follow-up as we work through the code with different projects. So that staff requested section is really just some cleanup items. First one up is discussion on short-term rentals. One of the things we'd like to do is update the definition, really for consistency with the building code. Current definition limits a short-term rental to 6 bedrooms, but doesn't talk about the occupancy. As we've studied more on the building side, the terminology shifts and the code requirements shift once you exceed 10 people in the short-term rental. So recommending that we remove the bedroom count and add a maximum occupancy of 10 persons, because once you exceed 10 under the building code, it effectively becomes a hotel room. And then it goes to a commercial building code and a different construction requirements.
So, not to interrupt, but are we going to go through this and then open the public hearing for all of our discussions?
Yes. Yeah, I'll run through each of them, or all of them, and then we'll open one public hearing and open dialogue from there if needed. One of the other ones that we've talked about, not recommending a code change, but one of the things we've found through looking at different cities' requirements for short-term rentals, one of the common one is to have a local contact, either a property management or family member, friend, neighbor that is willing to be that local contact for the short-term rental. Ranges anywhere within an hour to 2 hour travel distance. So obviously Kerrville, not isolated, but to a larger location, hitting San Antonio or Austin, that hour to 2 hour limit would be, in my opinion, I think would be reasonable. We do have some owners that have come through the conditional use permit process that are in San Antonio, Austin, Spring Branch area. I would recommend we just use that as one of our standard conditions. And we'll just include that in upcoming cases as a new recommended condition for each one.
I like that.
Except I would pick a number.
Right. And I'd say 1 to 2 because, obviously parts of Austin are outside of that one area travel time, but we do have quite a bit of
Maybe just 2.
2 hours. Okay.
Okay.
And if we find an issue with that as a condition, we can just easily update and make
Well, and
changes.
the reality is if they live any further than that away, they need to designate somebody locally to monitor it.
Right.
Yeah.
And I've actually haven't had an application, but I've talked to a customer that actually lives in Canada from Kerrville, has family in Kerrville, and is looking to split time and was considering short-term rental. We'll see if that customer comes back, but obviously we'll be looking for
That's
a local
problematic.
contact.
That's problematic.
One of the other things that we've talked about from staff standpoint is should we include a license or a permit requirement? And I know it gets a little confusing, so we have a conditional use permit process for the zoning entitlement to then turn around and have a license or a permit requirement to operate the business. A couple of things that have come up, we would intend that to be a one-time permit. That's why I don't think license is quite the right word, but then we've got duplicate processes. One-time permit, basically to verify that they have their tax payment account set up through our third-party company that works with our finance department, and to verify the parking. We've had a couple of comments, and we've done a survey of all the approved conditional use permits. They come here, they haven't built the parking, but they show that they've proposed parking without any kind of an official permit. We don't have a formal follow-up process.
Right.
So that's one thing we're looking to recommend, is to require that. Once it's approved, unless they stop using it, the conditional use permit expires, the short-term rental permit would expire, and then we go that route. But just trying to find a way to develop that process for the follow-up.
Those are great ideas.
On that, we did do a survey of the ones that have been approved by conditional use permit. Off the top of my head, I think there were two that have not finished construction, either remodel. One of them was new construction. They haven't even started building the house. Third one just was approved. They have ample room for the parking, but obviously haven't installed it yet. That one was approved by council last month. And then there was one, I might need to go check dimensions because it looks a little small.
Aren't they all, when they're approved, subject to providing all the requirements, which includes parking?
They are.
And that can be revoked if,
It initially wouldn't be a revocation. The initial contact would be a letter from code enforcement saying there's a notice of violation. Work with planning department to get that violation corrected. If they don't install the parking, then it would go to citation. Once they get a citation from municipal court, then we may talk to council about going
Can we
back.
not approve the CUP here and then you don't issue it until they've met all the qualifications?
Not the way the resolutions are written. Once council approves the resolution, it is approved.
Okay.
But then they are required to meet those. So
Right.
before they start operating, they should install that parking. I think that's where the permit,
Yeah,
the secondary permit could come into play is
being you don't get your permit to actually operate it until
Right.
you've met the conditions of the CUP.
we'll go do an inspection, see that
Right.
you've installed the new parking, then sign off on the.
Okay.
and they
that
verify
second
the
piece.
tax payment account as part of that too. That's-
Yes, and that one's actually not, we haven't had too many issues with that. Once they go through the CUP process, they get with finance and sign in, log in, get that account set up. But just to make sure that we're catching all those pieces. One of the sections that it was carryover from the old zoning code was a section that referenced the use of one property located in one zoning district to benefit another zoning district. Typically, that's going to be your parking lots, access, drive-throughs, maybe getting into like some accessory buildings. Based on the circumstances that we've seen this has been used, we're actually recommending removal of that section of the code. If that secondary property is truly going to be part of the primary property, then they should be looking at replatting, rezoning, and going through and truly incorporating it into one property, so it's not this kind of halfway across the line, using it for different uses. So we're actually recommending removal of that entire section.
So the question is, that piece of property that's in another zone, it's got another zoning, is it doing something that is not approved in that zoning to support another business?
So it should be, and I apologize, I didn't put the whole section of code up there. It should be if you're in District 1 and you want to put a parking lot in District 2, the use should be allowed in both districts.
Correct.
And that's the way it's drafted. But it's not crystal clear. And as you get into, depending upon the spread of intensities of those zoning districts, that could still start to cause a much bigger impact than I think
It
initially
needs to be
intended.
clear.
So, rather than try to redraft it and reword it, and I think it'd be best just to remove it. And if a situation like that comes up, they
Bring it here.
can work with staff and come to the planning commission and correct
Absolutely.
correct the zoning rather than try to manipulate this section to fit
Agree with you
some
100%.
really large unknowns.
Right. Great catch.
One of the ones that P and Z brought up, appreciate this, guys, because we've kind of had a lot of dialogue with staff trying to figure out how this would work, and obviously the benefit this would provide. As you recall, state law requires us to send property owners within 200 feet a notice by mail of a public hearing, which we do. But obviously, if you live 205 feet away or the next block over, you may not ever get notice, and it can certainly have an impact on you. I've had conversations with other communities about expanding that distance requirement, but then you start really overburdening how many notices you're mailing and what's the true impact.
Right, I don't.
Whereas this gives that visual representation. This property here that I drive by every day may impact me, and I may live 300 or 400 feet away. So I think it's a great idea. We've got a couple list of a few cities in Texas that we quickly, just doing some quick search, some comparable cities and obviously some larger cities here that do have a property posting requirement. certainly not an all-inclusive list, but Bernie, El Paso, McKinney, San Antonio, Schertz, Tyler, and Dallas. I didn't get that far in their code. And Dallas. So again, a lot of them are larger communities. I think there's tremendous benefit to the community to be able to visually see there's a sign, go to the city's website, look at the agenda, see how you think it's impacted.
So it begs the question of, if I see this sign, but I live 300 feet away from this property,
Want to check it out?
I would, but. you
Right.
know, you send notices out there within 200 feet, right? Those are the people that are the city considers being impacted.
Right.
I love the idea. I'm just curious to know if someone that lives 300 feet away sees the sign, comes in and wants to complain.
Right. And obviously, you guys are in the hot seat and get to hear those complaints and then really make that subjective determination. Is that really the impact that's going to impact that neighbor, impact that property versus the one next door? Actually had a conversation with somebody yesterday. If I live in the county, I own rental property and a business and commercial property inside the city limits. I don't get to vote for some of these things,
Right.
but these are public hearings and everyone gets a voice.
So we just send them to the city attorney.
Exactly. But I think the short answer it is a public hearing. We post it in the newspaper.
Okay.
So if I live across town, across the
Gotcha.
county,
Anybody can come in and complain about it.
anybody can come in and talk about it.
Okay.
You guys get that position of judging that impact as best you can. And obviously, what the case is going to depend on, is 200 feet enough, is 300, 400? Some of those impacts could be larger than that. For example, city does a couple fireworks shows a year. We now publish social media and the newspaper and do as many public notices as we can, because if you can't see them, doesn't mean you don't hear them.
Right.
So judging that distance based on the request is difficult, but I think this would provide the passerbys that opportunity to think, I do need to be there and I do have an impact. So
What's going to be the time duration on the sign?
I would recommend, I didn't put it in there, it's in there, in your packet.
Is it?
Make sure I'm on the right page. I think it's on your last page.
It is.
In calendar days.
Last page. I would recommend 10 days, and where
Before.
I'm taking that from is the notices that get mailed out are mailed out 10 days prior to the public hearing, just for consistency.
Right.
I'd recommend that staff post those signs. As you guys see, we're trying to incorporate taking some photographs of the property so you guys get a good picture while we're in here. While we're out taking a picture, go ahead and post the sign.
Right.
Fairly generic sign. As you can see, some of these get, well, I guess you can't quite read. The yellow ones are pretty detailed. It actually was for a specific public hearing and had the entire posting language. I'd recommend more like this blue one that has, City of Kerrville, public hearing notice. Here's the website where you can find the agenda. And that way we're not having to replace these signs every month,
Right.
but can reuse them continually.
Right.
And then again, if the passerby is interested, they'll take the time to go to the website or call our office and figure out what's going on.
Is that what you think, David?
Would the sign go back out for council? You
We
just-
don't send letters for council,
I don't think so.
so I wouldn't anticipate that,
Okay.
but at least for planning and zoning,
Yeah. No, I think that's good.
okay.
My only recommendation, just based on some of these images, is make sure you get a sign that's large enough. If it is indeed, reusable,
Right.
then make sure it's something they can read. If you're passing by and some of these signs,
Right, yeah, those little yellow ones, you have to walk up to it, but,
Well, I think what's gonna happen in a case like this, if someone's interested enough, they're gonna pull up and get the information on. I agree with you. They need to be
they
visible.
may not know where to even to start to go
Right.
look. If they're not involved, they may not really even know where to
I
start.
think big letters, notice of public hearing.
Yeah.
yeah.
Big letters.
The other thing we're gonna be sensitive of as we kind of bring those specifications back, is it consistent with the sign code?
Yeah.
Obviously, we don't want to be violating the sign code too. There is some very general parameters for governmental signs, so I think we've got some flexibility. Obviously, taking out a big 4x8 every time isn't going to be feasible either, but definitely understood. We need to make sure it's not so small that they just think it's another real estate sign or a garage sale sign. Something that's recognizable. And here's a list of the things we're gonna talk about. Again, staff requested really came up from different projects or questions we've gotten from our customers. First one is shipping containers. The previous zoning code was completely silent to shipping containers. Not prohibited, not permitted. As you know, y'all probably pointed at least 3 or 4 around town. Some actually went through the building permit process as an accessory building. So they're properly secured, may or may not have electrical to it. Some were just set down and used as long-term storage. Picture at the top is right there on Memorial, just one that I've driven by and seen. The picture at the bottom, I don't know how well you can see that on your screen. This is at Shriner University at the ball fields. There's actually a shipping container right here, directly behind the dugout. I had to zoom in. I was standing at the sidewalk. I had to zoom in pretty far to even be able to tell what it was. This particular one is, Guillermo, what'd you say, 300 feet off the street?
Probably.
And their intention was to permanently secure it, use it for sports equipment for the athletic department. Obviously, less expensive than building a cinder block building or a metal building, but something they could drop in, get their electric permit, add some lights for their equipment storage as it's seasonal. They were the initial request. Shriner University was to find some way to be allowed to use them. One of the things that, looking at some other pictures around town that I've seen, just like I said, there's a few scattered here and there. One, we need to add a definition that a shipping container or intermodal shipping container. This definition is straight out of the building code. Six-sided steel unit originally constructed as a general cargo container used for the transports of goods and materials. So we're not necessarily talking about this as a building material, but like these two you see here, one that's just gonna be set on the property, anchored and used for storage. I know different parts of the country, you see buildings actually constructed out of them. Fully engineered, doors, windows, insulation. Obviously those become a structure rather than just a shipping container. So we're not talking about that type of use, but more like you see in these two pictures,
Storage purposes.
just something set in place. We're gonna use it and leave it just like it is. The current code only addresses shipping containers based on outside storage. So the residential zoning districts don't actually address them at all. So arguably they'd be permitted as an accessory building. Industrial manufacturing are allowed. Airport district is allowed. What the initial request was to allow it in the public and institutional district. That's where you get the asterisk there for PI. I would recommend we move to adding them to the land use table as a specific listed use, hence why we need to add that definition. So it actually becomes its own individual use on the land use table. Do not allow them in residential districts or the commercial districts like we previously had. Add public and institutional, and also add some additional supplementary requirements, which are pretty common and within the code. We've got several different sections that are different uses that have extra requirements based on that use. Limited to a property or a campus with a minimum of 5 acres. Just started with 5, not necessarily arbitrary, but obviously we're looking at a larger property. And the reason I went with a acreage recommendation, PI is that light blue color you see. So this is everything from your small neighborhood churches, schools, hospital, parks, Shriner. It is scattered all over town, so it's not really a geographical representation of anything. Even some of the utility substations are PI. So to try to judge the impact that the shipping container could have scattered out all over town, the goal was really to focus on those larger properties. Kind of following through that with the rest of them, set back behind or at least parallel with the front wall of the adjacent building. We don't want the shipping container out front, it needs to be to the side or the rear. Minimum of 100 feet from a residential neighborhood. container would be required to be screened or color matched to an adjacent building, similar to what Shriner's done. Actually found another set of containers between Water and Broadway. And the only reason I could see it was there was about a 6-inch strip of tan on top of a blue fence. Had about an 8.5-foot tall fence on a 9-foot container. Otherwise, you would never have seen it. So screened to obviously not have that visual impact. Containers should be permanently anchored so that if we have any big storms, they're not moving around.
If it moves that around, then we are all in trouble.
It's true, they are pretty heavy.
Yeah.
But just like any other accessory building, go ahead and just anchor them as required by building code. And then we don't have anything in the code currently that specifically allows a contractor to use them on a job site. We do allow that, but since we're going this far and as a specific use, I wanted to go ahead and add that a licensed contractor is allowed to use one on an active job site. So that's clear. I think
So
it is that.
you would specify what proper screening is and what proper anchoring is, correct? You would give,
Building code would cover the anchoring.
Okay.
Screening, we may need to expand that it's solid screening up to the height of the structure.
is something that
Fence, trees, shrubs.
doesn't allow it to be seen,
Right.
okay?
That's a good point. Add that.
And I guess I would assume the hurricane strips they use in Florida to anchor down like trailers
That's-
is not,
That typically would meet the building code.
would it? Okay.
Some of the accessory built, the storage sheds that you get at, Lowe's, Home Depot, whoever, there are certain tie downs in the ground with those types of straps. As long as they're installed correctly, those do count. Building height in the public and institutional district. Refer you actually to the second page of your packet. It's about the full code in here. Kind of read through the red lines. The way it's currently drafted, the maximum height in PI is 35 feet and 1 foot of additional height for 1 foot of additional setback from a residential district. The rest of the zoning districts have an updated version of this that you see kind of captured here in the blue. There's no maximum, no limit on height except adjacent to residential, where you get that 1 foot for 1 foot increase. 1 foot for 1 foot increase over 45 feet when you're 100 feet from the residential district. And then no windows above 50 feet adjacent to a residential district. This is comparable to the C3 and C2 zoning districts, where you have that additional setback for the taller buildings. But if you're not adjacent to residential, there is no maximum height. This came up looking at some potential projects at the hospital. Current hospital obviously is more than 35 feet tall. Most of the buildings around it are more than 35 feet tall. We just hadn't come across this yet. But looking at the different iterations through the zoning code, I think this, as we expanded to this graphic that you see, where you have that stepped increase in height, this district got missed when we updated that height restriction. So, would recommend that change. Back up just a few weeks, we talked about the subdivision ordinance. We required the traffic impact analysis for those applications on subdivisions. We briefly talked about zoning and how do we move that forward. If you don't have to plat and you're just coming in for zoning, what's the requirement for a traffic impact analysis? At this point, we're recommending that same worksheet for planned development district or mixed use requests. That TIA worksheet is based off the use of the property. So if it's a more or less a speculative zone case, I want to zone to a commercial zoning for commercial marketing, you don't have that use. So it would be very difficult to fill out that worksheet based on an unknown use.
Yeah, you gotta know what the use is to know what the traffic impact's gonna be.
Right. So I think this is one step further. When we have a planned development or mixed use, both of those do require a full concept plan. Uses are identified. then we can go through that worksheet to at least see if that development does. I think other communities that are a lot heavier on that TIA requirement actually require it all the way through building permits. The TIA may be required for a building permit too. Haven't gotten any direction, and I don't think we're really quite that far yet. One of the benefits Kerrville has is most of our major arterials are TxDOT right-of-way, and they have their own TIA requirements when needed. So this is just kind of supplementing that for some of these other projects. Garage sales was in the old zoning code and did not get carried over to the new zoning code. So currently, we have no rules for garage sales. Fortunately, it has not been a problem, but just something that we've noticed talking with customers, throughout the summer, getting those phone calls. Where can I put the signs up? How many garage sales can I have? The previous one was 3-day maximum and 4 per year or 90 days between garage sales. I'm just recommending we mirror that and add that back into the zoning code. Had quite a few discussions this last year about fences. With the new height requirement or height limitation on front yard fences, there's been some confusion on ornamental fence. What you see here, kind of that wrought iron style, would be the typical vernacular for an ornamental fence, but we don't have a definition of that. Without that definition, we can't enforce that. So recommending adding both illustrations and definitions for screening fence and ornamental fence. And then you see in your packet there on the top of the third page, got the definitions, that third paragraph. Also to change the section that talks about fencing in the front yard, maximum height of 30 inches. To include that section, ornamental fence may include a brick, rock, concrete, or solid base not to exceed 30 inches in height. Between talking with our enforcement folks and our legal department, we've got 2 conflicting opinions if this fence would be allowed based on current code. One said yes, one said no. So let's clean it up and let's just go ahead and define it. The goal for that limited height on the front yard was the visibility. So up to 30 inches can be solid. Above that, up to 6 feet can be ornamental. It's not a requirement, but certainly want to allow it if somebody chose to do that.
We had a previous case that was requesting for a variance for screening in lieu of fences, and before that was just kind of brought to us, it was pretty subjective. There weren't any guidelines. Is there anything that y'all could start to look at to outline what may be acceptable for a variance for using vegetation as screening or landscape as screening?
The new code does allow landscape as screening
Okay.
in conjunction with a chain link or wrought iron or some other
Okay.
physical barrier. The screening obviously is both a visual and a physical barrier. So landscaping is now an option in the code.
Okay.
There is still the third option of either just waiving the screening requirement or some other alternative that they may come up with that does come before the planning commission. We didn't get into specifics of what those requirements would be, just to leave it open for case by case. The first one that comes to mind was the car wash on Sidney Baker that backs up to the cemetery. That was under the old code, but the code read adjacent to a residential district, screening is required. The cemetery was zoned R1, so obviously there was an existing 8-foot chain
It's a
link fence
residential
anyway.
It's a resting place.
The maintenance crew, the owners, and obviously the tenants did not mind not having screening, so that did come before the commission, just to waive the screening requirement altogether. I wanted to update the RV park regulations. The current section for travel trailers and recreational vehicles really talks more specifically to the RV, but not how the RV would be treated in an RV park. So I wanted to expand that a little bit and clean up some of the language to show that they're in an RV park. We do not have a specific time limit. In a residential zoning district, there is a 14-day limitation. So if in-laws come into town, bring their RV, they can stay for 14 days. City code says they have to move. the way it was drafted before, there was, at least among staff, there was a lot of confusion if that 14 days applied everywhere or just residential. The other piece we're looking, it's gonna run concurrent with the zoning code to council, updating the building code to adopt NFPA 1194. That's the National Fire Protection Association. One of their volumes, 1194, is specifically designed for RV park guidelines, design guidelines. I know, Mike, you could appreciate it. Turning radiuses, dead ends, what kind of turnarounds, access, clearance between parking spaces, what angles for drive-through versus back-in, and obviously a nationally recognized set of standards. So we'd like to adopt that. It's actually a building code adoption, but we're gonna adopt that along with this update. So Fire Marshal's office has reviewed that. We've actually presented that to a couple of the smaller RV parks that have been looking to add on or upgrade or build new ones. And they agree having some kind of design guideline helps everybody. So there's real clear expectations.
For safety, is there anything related to the propane tanks that are typically,
Don't quote me on it, and Mike, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe up to a certain size under the transportation code they're allowed. I don't believe some of the larger, long-term storage tanks are permitted in an RV park.
I don't think they are, and it's also subject to, there's a set of regulations and guidelines for LPG gas
you'd hope so, yeah.
containers and everything, and that
Yeah.
would probably supersede anything that a local RV park put into place, but there are guidelines that
Yeah.
you deal with.
Once you get into some of the larger tanks, the natural gas or larger propane tanks, actually the Railroad Commission rules
Right.
step in. But I think under the transportation code that they're limited to the smaller, 2 or 3 size bottles.
So I just want to ask a question, going back to where we started with the time frame. If someone comes into a residential area, there's a 14-day limit on how long you can, and you said other areas. Is that the limit? Otherwise, if you came in, you parked your RV at Walmart, is it a 14-day limit, or is there a different?
So it gets a little tricky because Walmart isn't technically allowed to have an RV park. So obviously they do, most Walmarts around the country do
Right.
allow
Correct.
that short-term parking. Zoning code doesn't really specify in the commercial areas, but if you're in an approved RV park, there's no time limit.
Correct.
If you're in residential, it's limited to 14 days.
Sure.
Is that 14 days, just a 14-day period? Like if I pull out and come back 2 days later, do I get another 14 days?
You-
Okay, just checking.
Depends on what your definition of pull out is. Go drive around a
Go to
corner,
Walmart for
Go
2
to
days.
Walmart, come back.
And we could certainly look at expanding that beyond residential if we want to say outside of an approved RV park, the limit is 14 days.
You know, I don't know if that's necessary. I was just curious because knowing that, Walmart is famous and you see those RVs parked in there, I never monitored to see if it's more than 14 days. I just wondered if someone was to complain that RV park's been parked there for a month.
Right,
I mean, technically it's private property.
right. It's
So-
private property, but it's not allowed as an RV park. So there
Right.
could be, arguably, there could just be a normal code compliance issue. This is now being treated like an RV park. We need to have that conversation of compliance on the zoning code altogether. Or if it's just general notification to the manager of the business and the owner of the RV. I think
Right.
it's not
I
drafted
don't
in
really
code
think it's a
necessarily, but
big
we're
issue.
kind of, and we haven't gotten any complaints.
Yeah,
that
I mean,
way
it's just
so.
a curiosity.
Okay. Land use table update, adding the shipping containers, of course, like we talked about. You got that little snippet in your backup there. And adding medical office to the public and institutional district. I know we talked about, as we looked at the land use table, the PI district allows for hospitals. Obviously, around hospitals, there are other technically not connected to the hospital, but separate doctor's offices and such. So I just wanted to add the medical office to that PI district. And other than that, there's our schedule moving forward. Obviously, we're here tonight, looking at December 14th for the first reading at City Council and January 11th for the second reading. So be pleased to answer any questions before or after, during the public hearing.
Let's
and I
open
can-
up the public hearing, see if anyone wants to speak, and that way you can grab all the questions. So we'll open up the public hearing at 5:05. I don't know if there's anyone here that wishes to speak on this issue, or any of these issues. If not, you guys have any questions that you want to ask inside the public hearing? So we'll close the public, yes, ma'am?
I just, I'm not real well versed on what you've been talking about. The short-term rentals, are those bed and breakfasts?
Ma'am, can you identify who you are
Julie Reeves from Kerrville,
and your address is?
853 Clay Street.
Ma'am,
And are those short-term rentals bed and breakfasts? Is that what those are?
Usually your Airbnb, VRBO.
So you're proposing not to worry about how many bedrooms, but just to allow a maximum of 10 people to stay there, whether it's one night or 3 nights or whatever?
Correct.
well, that's a question I have as well, because we do have in the present conditions for a conditional use permit, it's occupation is done by bedrooms. And
The
Parking.
parking is by
parking, I'm
bedroom.
sorry.
Parking's,
Occupancy is still max of 10. So the parking will still be limited or required by bedroom. We're just not having a bedroom count as a maximum number.
So if I have a one-bedroom, short-term rental,
Still
I'm
required,
allowed to have 10 people and stay in that.
right.
Is
what
that-
happens if they all come in 10 cars?
They can't
park
park
there.
cars. The parking is a strict requirement.
Right.
Is that not something that I've never thought about it very much, but one of the biggest concerns with most people that come in here and are not happy about these conditional use permits in their neighborhoods is the number of people that stay.
Right.
I guess I've not thought about this a lot, but how can you have a short-term rental that has one bedroom and you allow 10 people to stay there?
Obviously, that's going to be size depending. Most of the, at least personal experience, all the ones I've stayed in have a maximum occupancy when you check
The
in.
owners have a maximum
the
occupancy.
owners have a maximum
So if you
occupancy.
owned a one-bedroom, you're not gonna allow 10 people to be there.
Right.
But you kinda
Um,
gotta rely on the owner to
Right.
and
draw
I-
a line.
I guess that's
I've
kind of
gone
gone
on
over my head a
a
little
trip
bit.
before staying in downtown Albuquerque with an entire loft. Had multiple, I mean, it really wasn't
Had 5 beds.
bedroom, but
yeah.
because it was open space loft, couches and bunks and that kind of stuff, yeah, we probably had eight or nine people there, but it was,
But your parking is also gonna restrict that too. I mean, if
Right.
you got a one bedroom, you only got one spot to park.
yeah.
So
I guess I'm just thinking about,
And really,
5 couples aren't gonna come, you
I'm
know,
not even thinking about couples, I'm thinking about a bunch of,
kids.
single young females or males that's all pile in a van.
Right.
Show up with one parking space.
The reason I have such an interest in it is because I owned a home in Fredericksburg for 12 years, and Fredericksburg has hundreds of bed and breakfast, and a lot of them are in the residential areas. And that's finally what drove me to sell and run away as fast as I could, because all the bed and breakfast opened up around me on my little residential street, and you'd have a home with maybe 2 bedrooms, and those property owners, a lot of them didn't live in the area. They didn't care. They were just there to make a buck. They'd buy these houses, put a bed in every room except the bathroom, pretty much. And you'd have bachelorette parties, you'd have wild parties with all kinds of things going on. And there was no regulation. And I would come home and they'd be parked in my yard. They'd be parked up and down the street. You would have 5, 8, 10 people meet to stay in the bed and breakfast for the weekend. And you'd have all those cars. And there's nowhere for them to park. So that was my concern with parking. How are you going to regulate the parking? Where are these people allowed to park and not allowed to park? Well, one place thought they'd fix it. They'd put a parking lot in the back of their house. So now, in a residential area, we had people driving in the little driveway to the big old ugly parking lot that used to be the backyard and parking 10 cars packed there. So that's Fredericksburg.
That's not gonna happen here because anything that they do anything they do, correct me if I'm wrong, requires a permit to build a parking lot, and the city of Kerrville is not gonna allow you probably, I might be wrong, I don't know.
I mean, technically you could pave your whole property. But keep in mind, this is just a definition. This is not the enforcement tool.
Correct.
So if the way this is geared, if you bring a project that's intended to house 12 people, it does not qualify as a short-term rental. Then we'd look at it as a small boutique hotel or whatever term you want to call it. It is now a hotel or a motel.
Well, that wouldn't be allowed in a residential.
And it's not allowed in a residential district. So this really isn't intended to be the enforcement tool.
Correct.
The enforcement tool comes through the conditional use permit process, coming to planning and zoning for a public hearing, city council for the public hearing, and the conditions that we apply to those resolutions. Standard parking is 1 parking space per bedroom,
Right.
plus 1 for the off-site manager,
All off-street.
all
All
off-street.
off-street, right. There is
can't
no
res-
on-street parking
Yeah.
allowed for conditional use permit, short-term rentals in Kerrville.
We can't
Maybe that's why they
restrict
parked
them
in my
from.
yard.
It's off-street.
Well, I'm glad you're on it because there's a lot of potential difficulties in Fredericksburg.
It's a
really
hot button
lost
issue. We've
control.
had quite a few have come through here, and we've had,
Struggled with it as well.
we have struggled with it. I take a long look at them because depending upon where they are, I mean, I've voted against several because they're in a quiet little neighborhood, not conducive to, short-term stays.
Yeah.
The
It's very
consensus of,
disruptive to residents. I mean, like I said, that's why I sold. Because I had a B&B on both sides and they would show up at 2 a.m. and they'd be drunk and they'd be doing fireworks in the backyard. I mean, you can't even imagine. And I was in a residential neighborhood right in town. I wasn't on Main Street. I was 8 blocks up. And so it's very hard to regulate it once it's going on. It's, what do you do?
Yes.
Call the police and they're like, well, we'll get there eventually. By that time, it's all quiet on the Western Front, so.
it's a little bit different in Kerrville because we're not a tourist destination.
Yeah,
And most of the people
And
that
they draw
have come
families.
through here, they're charging a pretty substantial price, $300 a night, and they're not getting,
What we've been presented with is typically they're aimed at the couples,
Yeah.
the bicyclists and the
Right.
motorcyclists.
Yeah,
and
I
things.
know.
visiting nurses for schools and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So
So
I don't know. I
hopefully,
mean, I'm
yeah.
not privy to the complaints, but
Hopefully
We
we will
did.
turn into Fredericksburg.
We did work with the police department recently to pull, at least from
thank you for
January,
your comments, man.
January 2021 to, I guess it was a couple weeks ago, just to see the list of short-term rentals that we have, both conditional use permit and grandfathered. Total of about 63 addresses with the general complaint and call list through PD. I think there were roughly 11 hits that came up with one of those addresses.
Complaints?
I think, don't quote me on the number, I think 7 of them were traffic stops. One was a warrant issue. I don't even know if that was an active short-term rental or not, but executing a warrant.
Basically just stop in front of.
Yeah, I think there may have been one that was trespassing, but there were no noise complaints, no parking complaints, animals, fireworks. So at least in 2021, we haven't had that problem. And like you said, this board's certainly been sensitive to it. Council's shared those same concerns. So we are watching it closely. Like I said, we currently have about 60 to 65 active ones through our tax discovery process, both through conditional use permit and grandfathered, comparable to Fredericksburg, between 700 and 800 units. So
So, is there anyone else that wishes to speak on any of these issues before I close the public hearing? Because I have some comments, especially about the short-term rentals. So if there is no one else that wishes to speak, I'm gonna close the public hearing at 5:13. Anybody have any comments about anything that Drew has brought up?
I have something that,
I would like to hear, did you send your?
no, just the three of us.
I would like for David, he sent me some ideas about these short-term rentals, sent it to Drew, which I think are some good points. I really like the short-term rental thing. I really like obviously the bedroom count doesn't really mean anything if there's still a maximum occupancy of 10. I don't have any issues with that. I really like the idea of requiring a local contact and pick a number, whether it's 1 or 2 hours. And I actually think that when the short-term rental gets a conditional use permit, subject to the parking and the things that are required, I think there really needs to be a very, very specific time frame on you have to provide the parking before this thing opens within a certain amount of time. And I really do think that there should be some type of a license that you have to apply.
Well, I like the idea of doing, we approve the CUP, but they can't begin to operate until they get the license, and to get the license, they've gotta meet the
Love it.
conditions of
That's
the
exactly-
CUP.
I
I
agree.
think that's the best way to monitor that, and you can verify.
Mike, remind me, which one is typically an annual renewal, license or permit?
Permit.
So a license could be one time.
Well, they both can be one.
Just make sure I'm
one
using the
time.
right term.
I don't have a problem with one
You can call it
time.
whatever you
Whatever
wanna
you
call
call
it,
it.
but I
Yeah,
just
we'll-
think,
We'll get the proper tool, but I hear what Charles is saying. But you want an annual permit, or you want one?
just one
I actually
time.
think,
One time.
I agree with Trish. I think once you get approved, you go get your license, or whatever
But
you
you
wanna
can't-
call it.
but you can't get it until you've met the
And
conditions.
get it until you've
of
met the
CUP.
conditions of the, and then it's good as long as you own the property. I mean, I don't think
I
it,
agree.
cause I mean, I think this verify the tax payment account is a real tool.
Well, and the whole parking thing, if they've gotta go build out some parking, let's make them do that first before
Exactly
they can
right.
operate as B and B.
And that solves that problem of they don't have the parking yet, but
Makes it a little more urgent.
Well, and I think it's akin to the way we regulate group homes. So group homes have to be, there's some use restriction zoning wise, and then you have to have a permit. I think it's a permit.
Yeah, it's permit.
Yeah. So,
group
And-
homes understand with an annual permit.
Yeah. but I mean, they're both businesses, right? And then
Correct.
what you could do is, instead of you dealing with a CUP where you have to revoke it, well, let me step back. Drew's right, we would enforce it first. Arguably, we'd go issue a citation, but we couldn't stop the use until we revoked, or had council revoke the CUP.
Correct.
With a permit, a business permit, we could do that administratively,
right,
pull a
that's
permit and say, hey, you can't use it, and if you use it, then we're gonna cite you for that as
No,
well.
that's a great idea. I really do.
Little added measure of protection.
And David, you wanna?
Okay.
David had some good points too, which I really agree with.
Well, one thing goes back to what you commented a minute ago. You looked at the area, and if it was a quiet little neighborhood, you weren't necessarily very pro.
Right.
And so that's kind of one of the feelings I had. And I initially thought that maybe restricting what zoning codes might be a possibility.
Right.
And I thought, well, maybe there's legal issues there, but then I looked at Fredericksburg, and they've got a list of SRTs that are, or excuse me, STRs that are prohibited in certain areas.
Right.
And so maybe that's a possibility.
It is a possibility. We could look at the different, of course, we've got residential estate, R1, single family, R1A, which is your single family, which allows the accessory dwelling unit, R2, RM, which is a residential mix, and RT. RT, they are allowed by right, because that's kind of that buffer area, quasi-commercial, quasi-residential. But currently, all the rest of those residential districts is a conditional use permit. They don't all have to be. If you wanted to identify one, let me go back to that zoning map real quick. If you wanted to identify one particular district that we think is sensitive that shouldn't have them, we certainly can. I think it's just the question's gonna be,
By doing that, are you gonna start having heavy concentrations
That's-
of B and
that's what
Bs
I
in
was
other
thinking.
areas that it is allowed
That's
in?
what I was thinking.
that would be
Instead
my
of
fear. And
scattered
so
about?
just as one example on the map, so you guys can see, this kind of pale yellow color is R1. That little brighter yellow here is R1A. This kind of olive color is R2. RT, as you guys know, kind of surrounds downtown. Is that orange? It's kind of hard to see on this map. So if we removed R1, just as an example, those part of the map that you can see here is most of those neighborhoods that are kind of on the edges of the map here. That would arguably push them further into the center of town, into the R1A area.
Have you platted, have you created, we were talking about creating a map and locating all the existing CUPs for short-term
Yes.
rentals?
Yeah, we had that
See
at
where they
the,
At the
are.
last meeting.
yeah, we had that at the last meeting.
That's right, we did, didn't we?
I'm thinking about, you talk about Fredericksburg, how highly concentrated it is in certain areas of town, and that's probably why.
And the conditional use permits, I think, and Ariel, jump in, most of the conditional use permits have been pretty close to the center of town,
Yes, because that's where all the
but
amenities
the ones
are.
that are grandfathered stretch from
Yeah.
north to south. I mean, we've got, I think there's one or two grandfathered in Comanche Trace, there's a one or two in River Hill, up towards Starkey Manor, that area, up near the Meridian. And then, like I said, everywhere in between. So I think currently they are pretty well spread out. Obviously, the market side of it, similar to Fredericksburg, what's the driving factor for the visitors to be here? In Fredericksburg, obviously, it's kind of the main street downtown area. Kerrville, as we've talked about, the amenities that the customer identifies for y'all's review has been all over the place.
Right.
And can't necessarily disagree with it. Some are here for golf, the triathlons.
The river.
Some are here just for motorcycle trips to tour the entire hill country. Some are coming just to go fishing on the river. So
What was you also made a comment about required distances between them?
Yeah, like the group homes, like Mike commented.
Not a bad idea.
They have a fixed distance that's got to exist between two homes.
yeah, we could. We'd have to kind of look and see, maybe map
Obviously,
some
that's
out and
going
see what that.
forward, that doesn't include anything that's,
Right.
you know.
Right.
People who
existing.
bought side-by-side homes and.
Anything that's been approved or grandfathered would
Sure.
remain. But moving forward, we could look at, kind of map out what that distance would look like. I think the other thing you brought up was kind of a cap. You know, let's say we're at around 65, let's say we want 70 and that's it. My opinion is that just starts to create an unfair market.
Pretty sure you're not gonna be able to get away with that.
Yeah,
No, that'll raise all kinds of.
So I wouldn't advocate for that.
right.
I understand the point of not overburdening Kerrville with them. But I think if we're gonna go that route, maybe it's a percentage of parcels or something that's ebbs and flows a little bit. But that's just difficult to track on a regular basis. But the distance requirement may keep one neighborhood from having a heavy impact.
Well, I think, unfortunately, I think what you said is definitely true. There are certain areas that lend themselves to, they're close to the river trail, they're close to this or that.
Yeah.
And if you already have a couple there, you're gonna limit, I don't know how that's gonna fly.
Well, and I mean, and in some areas, it's just, and we probably would like to see more in a certain areas and mixed into our regular neighborhoods. It's just, I don't know how you nail that down
I mean,
to.
I like the idea of having a certain distance between them. I just don't know if that encourages them to go somewhere else where it's maybe less
Not.
desirable, but they can possibly get into a neighborhood that doesn't have them just because they can't go there. I don't know if it, if it creates more of a problem than we already have. I don't know.
Right.
And maybe
That was about it for me.
maybe until we, if we reach a point where we're seeing
Maybe that's-
problematic
Yeah.
situations and calls to the cops, maybe that's when we got to revisit some of the restrictions.
Do you recall seeing any towns with a distance requirement? Ariel did quite a bit of research for us, looking at different cities and different requirements, different processes for the short-term rentals to see how consistent the conditional use process is. Because council originally asked, should short-term rentals continue the conditional use permit process or not? We have a set standard of requirements that we've consistently adopted. Most have been approved, but not all. So council started asking the question, is that even necessary? Is it just an extra step that we're all going through?
Say again, what did,
Council originally asked, at least asked the question, should the short-term rental continue to require a conditional use permit? So that's why we started researching different communities to see how consistent that was. For the most part, a lot of the communities our size, outside of a metropolitan area, they do require a conditional use permit. So we're fairly consistent with most communities our size.
I think we definitely have to.
oh, I absolutely agree, because if you take
When
the
I-
conditional use permit process out, how do you,
Yeah, you'd have no control. As we went back to
be
council.
harder to turn them down.
Yeah. we went back to council with kind of some of that research response, and they absolutely supported leaving the process the way it is.
That's good.
So,
Well, I mean, the suggestions you've made about the permitting and everything, I think it's a great idea.
Okay.
And I think, I like what Trish said about, you can get your license whenever you have your parking.
Met all your requirements.
Right.
yeah, and
Absolutely.
At least that
If you
gives you,
don't
that gives
use
you
it-
guys, that means, so then if they don't have everything already set, that gives you, that cues you to go look and make sure
Right.
it's done.
and we've seen one or two that have rented before they got their conditional use permit, found out about it, sent them through the process, and they've come through here. So I don't think our system is flawed, but adding that follow-up piece will definitely be a benefit.
It also could be just some language when they come before P and Z that, if you open before you have all the requirements,
We'll
you're
remove
subject
your
to have that
CUP.
conditional use permit revoked, you can come back in a year. You know,
Yep, we can look at that.
I would look for license renewal periods, because if the CUP is valid for the, is indefinitely, contingent upon continuous occupancy, or whatever that time period was, you don't really have any reasons to understand that if you're looking at enforcement, if they add bedrooms or add on to the house, how do we know that they've updated what they're
That's
required for?
true.
It's true.
It's, one-time permit, one-time CUP, and then they don't.
I'm okay with an
Report
annual
it to-
permit.
So the way,
I
Well,
mean, I'm
revenue.
okay with some type of a permit renewal. I don't know if it needs to be 1 year, but maybe,
Yeah, probably not
could add
every year,
something.
but
yeah, maybe every 2 year, 3 years or something like that.
Yeah, we
That's
can
a
look at
good
that.
point, that you don't know.
obviously, part of that is just because staff time processing it.
Yeah,
Obviously, if there's a renewal, there's got to be a fee to pay for that staff time. We don't want to just become overburdensome on paperwork
yeah,
side.
but I mean,
But
it's
to
a
that point, there
business
is-
and, I mean, businesses have licenses and
Yeah.
licenses when they renew get charged. I mean, if you wanna have legitimate, short-term rental, I don't know that
It's a
that's,
small cost.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not
Right.
like
No,
you're running with
absolutely.
a large fee.
Obviously, if they pull a building permit, because our planning cases are in the same
Right.
system as our building permits,
Match it
you
up.
search that address, you'd come up, they're asking to add on a bedroom, they've got a conditional use permit for short-term rental,
what if they don't
Are they-
ask?
if they don't ask, right. And then there's the enforcement piece, building inspectors go out, stop work order,
is,
work it backwards, but
there's statistics on how many nights these conditional use permits are rented and how much,
I can check
what
with
do you call
finance.
it,
Hot tax.
tax that they,
Finance, I
that
think,
would be an
can
interesting,
extrapolate
that would
that
be an
data.
interesting, I mean, it's not necessary for us, but I mean,
Right.
that's another way to track, what these mean to the city.
Right.
I recently talked to one owner that currently has one. Since their approval, I think they said they're averaging 25 to 28 nights a month.
Remarkable.
Yep.
That's a lot of money.
That's very short-term rental.
Well, not 28
Not-
rentals, but they're occupied
Oh,
25,
okay,
25 nights out of
Other than-
30.
Yeah.
So,
that is good.
yeah, now they're, at least that one is staying full all the time. So,
I've got a couple of bank customers that have short-term rentals and it's very similar.
yeah, I imagine obviously some of those will be weekends, weekdays, weeks at a time, or a week at a time.
The driving factor was COVID because nobody wants to go stay in a hotel anymore. And so that's when that drove everybody to the short-term
Now that
rentals.
they've seen what it's like, they probably would rather be there than a hotel anyway.
Exactly. Because short-term rentals actually saw an increase in occupancy during COVID last year.
Correct.
Surprised.
The hotels dropped a little bit, not as much as we thought it would,
As much as other
but
areas.
short term went up tremendously. So,
They fled the city.
Well, the short-term rentals are probably a lot nicer than staying in a hotel, most of the hotels here anyway,
I haven't
and I
stayed in a
mean,
hotel in years.
I mean, the conveniences, I mean, the amenities and everything, the privacy,
so
cool.
sounds good. We'll take that into
Yes,
account.
guys.
We'll get some of that. You've got. So if you're happy with the way most of this is drafted, obviously not everything in front of you has drafted language to go with it. You can make a motion to approve it. We'll finish drafting it and send it on to council in final draft form. I'm trying to get to my calendar here, I'm stalling. Too far. Or we can bring it back just to review drafted language, to kind of fill in what you've got in front of you, November 4th.
I personally would like to make a motion to have this drafted and brought back before it goes to city council if we're gonna put our approval on it in November, since it's going to them in December. I like what you have.
Yep.
I think it's a great job.
Yep.
But it really would be nice if we're going to recommend it.
See another
that
draft.
it-
Yep.
so I'm
Sounds
gonna-
good. We'll
Agreed.
finish,
I'd like
finish
to-
drafting this out and we'll
Want
bring it
someone
back.
to make a motion for that?
I'll make that motion.
Do we have a
I'll
second?
second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All in favor?
All right.
Great.
That's all we have for you today.
Hey.
That's it, huh?
Time for the parade.
I'm gonna make the parade.
We're gonna
Just starting.
adjourn at 5:30.